Starting now, more or less. So let's begin with this. We are going to speak about the future, yet is it discoursing about the future events rather inappropriate occupation for those who are lost in traditions of the here and now? These are not my words, but are the words of the magnificent Lvivian writer, I should say, Stanisław in his Summa Technologica. And well, you could say that is a kind of thing what you could think of today, thinking about the future, about the transients, not only you here in Ukraine and in Odessa and in Lviv, where I work a lot, but also in Europe. So. And then especially talking about reconciliation. I very well remember that I tried this, I think about a year ago. There was this picture in the Kiev Post. The Kiev Post was a picture of a young woman in the neighborhood of Kharkiv, Odessa, not Odessa, the neighborhood of the Donbass, somewhere in the Donbass. And she was crying with a child on her arm. And I was very moved with that picture because it was one of the first pictures of someone without wearing a mask. The men are wearing the mask, and this was a woman who said, well, I'm really deeply worried. I fear what happened to my life and to my child. And then I wrote a little blog. And I said, I want a statue for Ira. So you could say that is a kind of an act of reconciliation. But to my surprise, what happened, that I got a lot of hateful responses. I should have known that this photo and this interview in the Kiev Post was a satire. This was actually designed by separatists and Russians to move me to make this act, to make me and others who had read this. So then I thought, okay, this is not so very easy to do, this idea of reconciliation. And this was for my reason to stop writing for a time about this. This is unknown territory. This is a territory where we are in a very difficult position. So you can easily see what difficulty is behind it. So, if you think about reconciliation, you can easily ask three questions. The first question is, okay, reconciliation, let's look it up. What is it actually? How to do that? How to reconcile? So you're trying to solve a problem to do that. And you're looking up what is written about it, and what we know about it, and so on. What you know about it. And you give like an answer that you give an answer to a question, a strategy. What do I know? What I know about this, and I'm going to use this. So this is one opportunity. And the second opportunity is what you can do. You say, well, I don't have a clue what this means, so I have to investigate. So I have to attend a conference, for instance, where people are going to explain to me what the reconciliation actually is and how difficult it can be and so on. And then maybe I get some good advice, and then I close my knowledge gap, and then I can make a step to reconcile. Does it work? This doesn't work? No. Hold on.
Yes, you will have to get the quotes for the interpreters. You have to do this one and this one and this one for your listeners.
This is really complicated. So I need to read. I want to get rid of this actually. So, and now that one.
You will first read.
So now this one. No, nothing can wrong. Can go wrong. So this was what you say, the second answer you can look for is what do I don't know about these reconciliations, and look for answers somewhere in books or conferences, and then I can come up with the good advice and then think by myself, okay, now I know how to do this. But unfortunately, you could easily say that doesn't work either. When we talk about this question about reconciliation, you have to ask yourself another question. And this is a question, what do I don't know, what I don't know? So what do I don't know, what I don't know? And exactly this is a bit puzzling, because how could I answer that kind of question? So you can't look it up in a book. You can't do something about it, well, I ask something about it, because I even don't know what to look for. And if I look back in my idea of working with Ira and thinking about the statue of Ira, this was a kind of thing what can be done. So make a move and learn from it. Reconciliation, you could say something about it, there is a lot to say about it. There's also always a very good reason to postpone it. Let's not do it now. It's too complicated. Very good reason for it, and it is. So, but there is of course one way only to find out if it can be done, and that's simply start doing it and see how it works and see where it goes. So, and then get beaten up on your head like me. And that's thinking about, okay, I have to learn. Because this is not the right way to do that, probably. Because my friends are now hating me. My friends! So that is stupid. So I have to learn. So, this idea of statue for Ira, and this idea where I came up with thinking about reconciliation, and this theme of this conference, how to work on it. I want to talk about this making steps forward and thinking about how to do that, this make step forward. But because we are the first one in history, so it's a bit paradoxical that I'm going to go back to history to look at it. But how to do that, and what kind of examples did you have in history, and actually what does it mean to do that in this area, Odessa, or what one of my favorite writers on Ukraine, Anne Applebaum, wrote about this. Maybe you know her. She wrote some beautiful books about the Gulag, terrible subject, good book, and about the Iron Curtain, terrible subject, but good book. But one of her books, what I like most, is called From East to West. And then she's actually traveling from Kaliningrad, Königsberg, to Odessa, and going to Poland, Ukraine, Lviv, Chernihiv, and then the last stage of the traveling is Odessa. And this is, we're traveling through the borderlands. And this is actually a very, I think, a moving book and a very courageous book, because she did that in 1994. So it takes something for you. And there is one thing I want to share with you. What she, in one of the interviews, you had a conversation, she said, by accident in Vilnius, with an Ukrainian linguist, whose name she keeps concealed for us. So we still don't know who it is. And this Ukrainian linguist ends this paragraph, this chapter, was basically on memory, with the following sentence. And that, he said, was the most Ukrainian thing of all. To read the history of your country as if you were reading it through an outsider's eyes. It was the fate of borderland nations always to know yourself through the stories of others, to realize yourself only with the help of others. I found this very revealing. I found this very revealing in a discourse on Ukraine, and a discourse on Ukraine, and a discourse on Poland, where everyone is involved, not everyone, but a lot of people are involved in looking for vindicative stories, for a narrative that can found your culture, your nation, your country, your people. And this Ukrainian linguist, whose name we still don't know, we can only know each other we can only know what it's been to be an Ukrainian through the stories of others. And that is, I think, a remarkable, let's say, appeal to all of us. We have not to look for ourselves, but for others, like a lot of what we have heard about this morning. I want to create a little monument in this hour for 3 of these authors who have tried to do that in the past. And try 3 authors who are deeply related to Odessa and to Lviv. The first one, you have a star on the street, that's Anna Ackmatova. She was only, to be honest, 1 year living in Odessa, but there is every right to claim her as a child of Odessa. So she's the first one. The second one is a Jew from Lviv, Ludwik Fleck. And the third one is this Pole, Stanisław. So we have the poet of all the Russians. We have the Jew, Ludwik Fleck. And we have the Pole. We have the Pole, Stanisław, who teaches us a lesson, what it means to think about memory from the idea of the borderland, the land of the other. So I want to try to make it in a few steps, because I think all of them, 3 of them, are actually a kind of pinpointing what you can look at if you think about this question of memory, reconciliation, and so on. So this isn't a surprise. Anna Ackmatova is basically the mistress of poetic memory. That's what she does. Ludwik Fleck, probably unknown, I'm not sure about that, but he is like a philosopher who thinks a lot about, or taught a lot about philosophy and history of science. And then the third one, Stanisław Lem, I call him like he is of the master of fantastic memory. He's actually very interesting because he points us to a way of thinking about memory, not of memories of the past, but of memories of the future. That makes him so fascinating, this Stanisław Lem. So let's start with Anna Ackmatova. Well, all of their work is of course extremely complex and challenging for us. But so we can't do them right in this, let's say, hour what we are talking about. But I still try to do that. There are especially 3 works of Anna Ackmatova who are very appealing when it comes to the ethics of memory. And the first one you probably know is called Requiem. And the second is The Way of All the Earth. And the third is Poem Without a Hero. 3 masterworks. And if we come to Requiem, it's basically about the bearing the burden of a witness, being a witness, as this moving opening sentences. And I'm going to read them to you, these few stanzas. In the terrible years of the Yes-Sov era, I spent 17 months on prison rides in Lenin. One day somebody identified me. Then a woman with blue lips who was standing behind me and who of course had never in her life heard my name before, awoke from the torpor normal to all of us and breathed a question in my ear. Everyone spoke in whispers. Can you describe this? I said, I can. Then something like a smile slipped across what once had been her face. Anna took upon herself in this poem the role of becoming a witness to suffering and death. Not only as a lyrical, personal impression, but also as a public. The poet, she says, cannot save the victims, but through her conscious act of memory, through the creation of a poem that serves as a monument to them, she can prevent the second death that would occur if they were forgotten. Requiem seeks to ensure that the memory of the present will be preserved in the future. So this is one day. Consciously bearing the burden of being a witness. In the way of all the earth, we find another theme. Anna seeks to return from the world of the present to a past preserved in memory. To find the way back to the past, to a youth and more innocent era. But each past scene in this poem has been frighteningly altered, as if the terrible events of the future, present, had already cast their shadow before. In the world of the living, the world of time and change, what is and has been cannot be disentangled. The clock cannot be turned back from the agonies of the present. There is no earthly way that leads back to paradise. Yet beyond time, on the far side of that, paradise continues to exist, unchanged and unchangeable, as a memory and a summoning fish, as justice to come. It is as reading the past through the eyes of God, following the lines of Wisława. We read letters of the dead and are like helpless gods, yet gods after all, for we know what happened. So this is the second message, how to relate to your past, your past history and your past relatives, your past people. And the third one, and probably the most complex one, is the poem without a hero. I think it's the most complicated of the three ones. And complicated, such as complicated that Anna never succeeded in finishing up this poem. There was this work in progress what this poem actually is. One of her friends wrote this itself. Anna was obsessed with it. And Mendelssohn complains, Ackmatova complains about the way in which Poem Without a Hero totally swallowed her up from the beginning and never let go of her. She threw herself to housework, scoring saucepans, washing clothes, sweeping, cleaning up, and all the other things she normally neglected in a desperate attempt to gain some respite and struggle free of this current carrying on of her into the unknown. She remained in the grip of the poem for a number of years. And next week, Anna Ackmatova did exactly confirm this in the rest of her work. She couldn't release her, and try as she might, Ackmatova could not again gain the release of putting her useful experience into a unified, meaningful perspective, because history had ensured that no such perspective could exist. Ackmatova's use had not faded away into natural death. It had been violently broken apart and replaced by a new order that did its best to disavow and to destroy the old. Poem Without a Hero resists and keeps resisting to become a part of a social imaginary. And that, it is of all the three poems of memory, the most beautiful angle of the words of our Ukrainian linguist. The fate of borderless nations, to know yourself through the stories of others, to realize yourself only with the help of others. Because isn't this exactly the case, that it is the other that deconstructs this unified, meaningful memory? So, in a sense, it could have been enough for this morning. Thinking about, like Anna Ackmatova, thinking about this, how she works with this memory, with this appeal of memory on her, and finding a way to relate to this experience, to these events, what you can't relate to, and keeping it, especially in this last poem, as an open space. There's an open poetic space where we have to keep working. So let me continue from this poetic idea, this poetic memory, to two other ones I want that shortly to get your attention to. The second one is Ludwig Fleck. Like Anna, Ludwig Fleck, Ludwig was not from Odessa, Ludwig was from Lviv. Most of his time living and studying in Lviv. He was a philosopher, but his profession was basically a microbiologist. So and he deserves really a mark. So if you look at Ludwig Fleck, so he was a scientist, and of course in due course when Lviv was occupied first by Germans, and then occupied, and first by Stalin, then by the Germans, and then of course Ludwig disappeared in a concentration camp in Lviv. And there he kept working as a microbiologist, as producing a vaccine against typhus, and he succeeded in that. So that is something to be, let's say, that reveals meaning, and this very unimaginable, difficult circumstances that you keep doing it. But one of the most interesting and most well-known contributions to thinking about memory and thinking about science, so to say, and relevant for what we are talking about, has to do with this idea of how scientific facts are actually in history constructed. So, even before Thomas Kuhn, in his Structure of Scientific Revolutions, he mentioned him actually, started thinking about paradigms and thinking about the social background of scientific development. Ludwig Fleck was already doing it, and he actually sent his book to Boris Schlick, then in the positivistic, Wiener Kreis-dominated way of looking at science, and he sent his book in search of recommendations. And why is Ludwig Fleck worth mentioning? Well, basically, this is that he so I would say so meticulously interested in that he says what actually counts as a fact is something that is, let's say, collectively, I don't like the word collective in this sense, but you can understand it maybe, not collectively, but in some other places he said democratically constructed in the process of scientific development. And it is constructed in a community of thinkers, a collective of thinking, a community of thinking, dominated by, let's say, dominated by a style of thinking. And why is Ludwig Fleck interesting? Because what he actually does is deconstructing what counts as a fact. He says fact is basically not totally a coincidence, but it's basically the result of an interaction of scientists working. So let's postpone a bit what Ludwig Fleck did for the science, and let's postpone it to the facts of memory. Yesterday we had a beautiful excursion here in Odessa. We visited the catacombs, a lot of monuments, and it was a lot about facts. So, and if you remember yourself that what is there presented in all honesty, but that's not, it was not an ideological, let's say, way of looking at it, are constructed in a community of memory, in a collective memory, then you can see if we want to open up, like Anna Ackmatova suggested, this area of memory, it means that we have to open up and seeing it as a way of constructing the history and constructing the future. That's actually what I think so important about Ludwig Fleck. And actually what he's saying about this is very revealing and very helpful of us. If we look at the dominating way of looking at history, as I have experienced it in working for 8 years in Ukraine, working in Lviv, for instance, and you could say that is actually dominated by certain ways of looking at history and constructing the idea of history as something we need, what legitimize memory. So you have these remnants of totalitarian way of looking at history. History with a goal. That's basically what it is. And you have the way of patriotic, nationalistic way of doing it. And if you are in Lviv, you have, and also I think here in Odessa, you have this more or less nostalgic way of looking at history. And then you have also this, like, you could say, a kind of folkloristic way of looking at history. So that is history that looks it from a point of view for where this history actually is meant for. The tales of the history. And actually what Ludwig Fleck suggests and opens up is the possibility, is the appeal to open up this idea of the telos. That this telos is actually, let's say, inhibiting, preventing, and has the purpose to prevent it, to look at the constructive part of facts in our, let's say, in our community of memory. That's why I think Ludwik Fleck, apart from his remarkable life, like of course Anna Ahmad, is so important for us to think about this as a companion who can help us, who can take us by the hand. Okay, look at this. Who is this community, actually? Who is this collective of memory? Who is constructing this fact? This beautiful story of the boy. Who constructed this? And what are actually the ways of this? So this is our second. This is what you could call with Ludwik Fleck a way to epistemic memory instead of poetic memory. And then the third one, what is for me one of the most specialized, and I only started reading and discovering Stanisław last year, I think, and discovered that he was also from Ludwik. And what a kind of remarkable oeuvre Stanisław has produced in his life, because he died in 2006. So, and I want to direct your attention to two of his books, who are, I think, especially relevant for memory. So, a lot of work for him is especially relevant for thinking about memory. The two books who I really find very interesting about it is the first one. This is where he's most famous of. It's called Solaris. You probably have known about it. And the second is A Perfect Vacuum. That is the other. So, and I want especially to talk about the second one, and the first one is just to remind you of something, because it's a bit my idea. I can't prove it, but it's a bit my idea. That Solaris couldn't have been written by someone else like Stanisław from Lviv. And I'll explain you very short. You know, probably if you haven't read the book, but I have to explain you, Solaris is a planet, and it's a planet totally covered with an ocean. And there is some serious problem of this planet, and it is a kind of a puzzle for scientists, so now they keep coming back to it. And then there is a scientist coming back to him, and because there's something deeply wrong. And in this book, there is this discovery, this investigation is what is actually going wrong now on Solaris. The main thing is this: Kelvin, he's the protagonist of the book. He's on this planet, and he sleeps. And then, when he is going to waking up, sees there's something in his room, someone in his room. And that happens to be his wife, who committed suicide on herself a couple of years ago, and where he felt some guilt about it. And of course he was flabbergasted about it. And it wasn't a perfect copy of his wife, because when he looked at her and she could speak to him and approached him, he saw, well, she wore a dress that he actually wore a lot in her life, but there was no zipper on the dress. So it was an imperfect copy. And then he tried to get rid of the copy and put her in a kind of capsule and sent her in space. But to his astonishment, the next evening, the next morning, she was again in the car of the camp. And with a better dress. So that's basically what it is. And step by step, they keep thinking about this. And he keeps thinking about this and discovers this astonishing ability of the ocean to create very lively physical images, especially of the memories you want to get rid of. That's actually what the ocean is doing. Now, I couldn't resist thinking about Lviv. So if you look at this way of looking at reconstructing history, so if you look at the center of Lviv, this is the perfect nostalgic center with a lot of good cafes and so on. But if you're sitting there, you see something, there is something missing. That refers to the Habsburg time, and you have the resistant cafe and all these kind of things. But there is something lacking there. And what is lacking is, of course, actually the tragedy of Lviv. But you can't ignore it. It's still there. It reproduces itself if you want it or not. And that's actually what happened. I think what is to imagine what Stanislaw then was creating with this bullshit, which has a kind of intelligence. It keeps reproducing the ghosts who you want to get rid of, but are still there. And in the end, Lem reconciliated, if I say the word, with the copy of his wife, and think, okay, let's try to live. So this is one thing. The other is the perfect. It's a book that cost. It's called the Perfect Vacuum. So this is one of symbolizing the working of the ghosts of Lviv. That's about Solaris. The ghosts of Lviv who were killed, who were sent away back to Poland, but you could feel them everywhere. And you could say, well, maybe Stanisław was doing something like that and creating a symbolic, let's say, a symbolic area that you can actually feel them what is it. So the second, and that is the most hopeful part, I think, what he produces, that is account of those book in Perfect Vacuum. It's a very disturbing book because you are going to read it, you're going to read the introduction, and the introduction in the Perfect Vacuum introduces, it is a book that I have to say before, it is a book about reviews of non-written books, especially it is an experiment with non-written books, and that is actually what the Perfect Vacuum is. So you see a lot of reviews of books who could have been written, but actually are not written. And the first step of the introduction of the book is a book of the introduction chapter of the book by Stanislaw. And you really got confused because there is no introduction in the book by Stanislaw. So this is a very interesting and complicated book. And it's very interesting if we make a few short steps thinking about what a review actually is. A review is, if you write, you very much like to be reviewed. It saves you for oblivion. So good or bad review, it doesn't matter. If you were reviewed, that means that you are remembered. So this is one thing. But the second thing, that is of course very special because Stanislaw is writing these reviews on books who even didn't exist. So that's what he did. He wrote reviews of books who didn't exist, but could have. And I think the interesting part of this is that it appeals to us that all books that have been written are a sort of a parasite of books what haven't been written. And it provokes us to think about these books what could have been written, that we could remember who should have been written, but aren't written yet. So it is a kind of thinking about not only about the future, about the memory of what has happened, but a memory of what could happen. And even you could try something like that if I had the courage to write a review on the book of Odessa on reconciliation, what has never been written. That immediately opens a possibility not to remember the past, but to remember the future. And that is exactly what this perfect vacuum for me is. So let's finish.
Yes, thank you.
Oh, no. There is some famous last word I want you to leave.
Okay.
I know you already. So these three, I think it's very, very interesting, and I want to come back to where I started. So, I spoke, as I hope, to create these three monuments for the task of acting and learning in a world of not knowing what I know. Three literary monuments who break open, deconstruct the domain of writing and memory of a totalizing them. Joseph Stalin wrote about this. And he talked a lot about writing and literature. And he said, the production of souls is more important than the production of tanks. Here, someone correctly said that the writer must not sit still, that the writer must know the life of a country. And that is correct. Man is remade by life itself. By you too, will assist in remaking his soul. This is important to the production of souls. And that's why I raise my class to you writers, the engineers of the human soul. Well, that's a bit chilling, huh? To think about what happened in this totalitarian rule as the production of souls. They are more destroyed than produced. And I think that Anna Ackmatova and Stanisław and Ludwik Fleck are actually working in another direction. They are not about the production of souls. Actually the other way around. The borderlands as the unique moral area of the other, where you are part of. The fate of the borderlands nations, to know yourself through stories of others, to realize yourself only with the other, that demands something else for you. Not to create your story, but to listen to the story of the other. All three, Lem, Fleck, and Ackmatova, embrace more or less the flavor of deliberately being unzeitgemäß, not being in time, as a precondition of an ethics of memory that does justice to the other. They demonstrate the hard personal work and sacrifice required to create a different green social imaginary. In hearing their voices and transforming in cité mémoire, they become our personal companions in our quest of reconciliation as a memory of the future. And as said, reconciliation is deeply moral and personal, as is memory. You can't have the one without the other. Let's give the last word to Anna Ackmatova to get a nice lunch. Today, there is so much I must do. Must smash my memories to bits. Must turn my heart to stone all through. And must relearn how one should live.
Уважаемые коллеги, вопросы по докладу? Может быть, вопрос для затравки там задавали? Так? Да, нет? Хотя бы один, да, пожалуйста.
Можно, да, я по-русски, да, буду спрашивать?
Да, просто говорите по-русски, переводчики переведут, если вы достаточно громко зададите.
Хорошо. Да, спасибо, я пытался очень внимательно слушать. Очень интересно, исходя из того, насколько мне было понятно вообще. По поводу аналогии вот этой с Станиславом Лемом и его отношению к Львову, да, как к своей родине. Ну, то, о чем вы говорили, это ваша личная аналогия или ну, как вы к этому пришли вообще?
So, thank you for the question. It's actually a very, very accurate question. The first one, it is what I would say my own idea, so to say, to come up with. But if I look at a bit at Ludwig Fleck, that there should be something in the air, that it shouldn't be my own idea, but there would be something else in Lviv that provokes this idea. And if I think about this, would have provoked this idea, I think this was my first meeting with Lviv and the people we are talking to and we worked with and so on, and kept telling me about the ghosts of Lviv. The people who are there are done and died. 85% of the inhabitants of Lviv actually did. So it is these people like Odessa and the people we work with and the ghosts of Lviv who really like provoked this. They are my community of memory.
Спасибо.
Спасибо большое. Если вопросов нет, то сейчас мы разделимся на две части. Мы просим наших уважаемых гостей, студентов философского и исторического факультета, тех, кто пришел к нам по объявлению на конференцию, остаться здесь, подождать нас. Там будет кофе, печенье, булочки. И через час приблизительно в 14:30 по плану мы продолжаем нашу работу. Наших участников конференции, the participants in conference, we ask to the ланч, участников конференции по спискам, по программе мы приглашаем на обед, и после этого мы возвращаемся